So, hello, my name is Richard Purvis. I'm a senior Apple engineer and integrator, and I can't actually tell you who I work for currently. So, please don't ask me, because the important thing is I am not representing any employer, current or otherwise. I am just here representing myself. So, now that the legal stuff's out of the way, just want to make it absolutely clear, when we come to do the Q&A at the end, the microphone is right there, and we'll see what we can do. If you want to find me online, you can find me on both Jamf Nation and Slack as username Franton. There is one person in this room who has worked out where that name has come from. Joel, shush. And if you want to find me, there's my personal website there. I have a lot of interesting Apple information on there as well. So, disclaimer time. I was told not to mention Corba, big data, cloud, Internet of Things, and containers. So I'd just like to say I never said any of those, okay? So, what am I faffing on about today? Thank you, Ben Toms, for introducing JNUC to that word. So we're going to talk about some legacy and the current macOS APIs as far as smart cards are concerned. We're going to talk about how legacy smart cards can be made to work via Jamf Pro. We're going to talk about CTK cards, and I'll explain what CTK is a bit later. And good, the clicker's going to work. And we're going to go into some limitations of actually using them. We might have to cover that one more in the Q&A later. So, what am I not going to be going on about? Because this is quite an expansive talk. History of smart card development, kind of interesting, but not for now. We'll not really go over some of the types of smart cards out there. If you do truly want to know about these things, I actually did a talk for another conference earlier this year where I did go through all this stuff in great detail. We're also not going to talk about PKA backend architecture. Seriously, you could fill a whole day talking about that. It's such an expansive subject. We're just going to concentrate on the macOS side and how to make the macOS bit work. And if you want to grab that link, I know some other people have done QR codes, but you'll find the link to this slide will be there. Also, the links to the slides from the other times that I've spoken about this. Each contains slightly different information. Piece it all together, and it's quite a good resource for all of you. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds while you all grab pictures of that. OK, all done? No, we've got one guy there. I don't know, can't quite see. The light's coming straight at me. So, there's some complimentary info, and I do need to give a big shout out to Brian Fox, who's going to be doing the talk on the DoD. Hi, Brian. He's going to be mentioning some of the challenges, and some of the challenges working for the DoD also involve smart cards. And that's 2:45 in the Greenway Ballroom today. So, oh, it's actually here, sorry. I do apologize. Because when I came up with these slides, I was actually in a different room, and I've been moved since. So, yeah. So I just want to say, because this is an expansive talk, I need you all to prepare yourselves, because it's going to be like this.
Open wide!
Yeah, I have to put in the bad jokes. So let's start with the Apple APIs for smart cards. So, a little bit of history. We got the legacy stuff under the CDSA acronym. That was first introduced in OS 10.4. Again, this has changed since I did these slide decks, because when I submitted these slide decks, 10.13 wasn't out. 10.13 is now out, and this stuff is still present there. I'm reliably told that it shouldn't have been, but it is. As far as the API stuff is concerned, we're going to talk a little bit about Token D. Token D is effectively the driver to read from the card. CCID, this is the acronym for the drivers to read from the smart card reader hardware itself. And smart card services is Apple's overall arching term for the entire layout. Smart card services actually has become an open source GitHub project, and that's quite easy to find online. The important thing to note is all of this was developed from 10.4 to 10.7 by a couple of guys at Apple, and then it was marked as deprecated in 10.7. So it's kind of been in a holding pattern since then. If anyone remembers System Starter from the early days of macOS, that was deprecated in 10.4. That lasted all the way till 10.10. This does not have a lot of life left to it. So let's talk about the new API. So from 10.12 plus, Apple decided that a new approach was needed, and they came up with something called Crypto Token Kit. This is quite an overriding API. It's meant to be the future direction for how smart cards are addressed on macOS. It does a lot of other security stuff in the background, and the important part to realize is that's it. They've actually simplified the model down quite considerably. So, with that little background, there's some universal configuration between all of this, and we'll go through that first before we get to the API-specific stuff. And the important thing to remember when you're dealing with smart cards is that smart cards contain a certificate, and that certificate is what is used to perform authentication and other tasks. If you've done any work with certificates, you'll know that it's very important that your certificates have a chain of trust. So you need the root CA certificate installed on your Mac endpoint in order for them to trust the cert that's on that card. And I cannot stress this point seriously enough. And the best way to do this is a configuration profile. And if you've ever dealt with deploying certificates to machines, you'll realize that there are many different ways you can do it, but only by a configuration profile will a certificate deployed to a macOS machine be automatically trusted. Apple considers the APNS MDM path to be a secure path. If you can you can wrap certificates in config profile files and deploy, they will not be trusted. If they are not trusted, they are not used. So let's create a config profile. And you don't have to do terribly much. Give it a name, give it a description. There's a generic one I threw in there earlier. We want it to install automatically. I mean, you could install it through self-service, but why would you? You kind of want this going out to everybody regardless. And the other important thing is it needs to go as a computer-level profile. It won't install as a user. This has got to be present for every single user on the system. So in the next slide, we'll just assign a scope. This is my personal way of doing things. I like to have it set to specific computers and specific users, and I have my own smart group at the bottom to say all machines managed. And the reason I do it like that is if I ever want to control the scoping, so I'm targeting a specific OS, I can do that with the appropriate smart group. But in this example, we're going to throw it to everybody. So now, we've got that configured. We need to attach the certificate to the profile. And in Jamf Pro, that's pretty easy because it's just as simple as uploading a file. And when you do upload the file, it looks like this. Obviously, I've got quite a few bits blanked out here. But you will see where the issuer name came from and the Active Directory path that things were generated from. You'll get the expiry date, you'll get the name, and you'll get a certificate name at the top. If your organization requires it, you will have to put in a password to unlock that certificate. It's probably not likely that you will have to. So that's if you want to deploy the file manually and you've just manually pulled it off the CA. But you can actually use config profiles to use Windows calls to retrieve and install certificates. This is not something I've personally tried, but I know it's something that people like Ben Toms have done in the past. If you're in an environment where you can guarantee that when the config profiles are hitting the machine, that it can also see the domain controllers, this would be the preferred way of doing it because you will get a recent root cert every time. And down there at the bottom is the Apple support link that describes how to do this. And I must apologize for keeping this jacket on and for umming and ahhing a bit because I'm really not very well. I've had somebody stinking cold since Monday. Anyway. And speaking of Ben Toms, that's his own blog post on how to do the same thing. And these are handy references. So once you've got your certificates on board and deployed to your system, you're now going to have to think about the middleware drivers. This goes back to the whole token D thing. This is how you make the card able to be recognized by the system. And a lot of middleware drivers out there, I mean, macOS does support some stuff natively, but if you're using anything more third-party that isn't sponsored by the US government, you're probably going to have to deploy a driver package file of some description. And for the most part, it's just a simple package deploy policy. You don't have to do anything clever. As you can see from that, I have a static trigger I call deploy, which I call whenever a machine's provisioned, and I just deploy to that point and forget about it until it comes time to updates, but that's another topic entirely. So you've got your certificates on board, you've got your driver on board. You're now going to have to think about the login window. And this is very, very important. You've got to set the login window to enforce list of users. So you get that series of icons come up with all the user accounts on a system. If you try and do the old traditional way in AD environments, putting a username and password box in, smart card authentication at the login window does not work. So it's very important that you have this set like that. And again, the best way is a configuration profile. Let's just enforce it and forget about it. And I've got some extra stuff in there that I would normally configure, but the important bit there is at the bottom. List of users being able to use these computers. And then you can tick those boxes to your heart's content. You can have it show everything. You can have it show almost nothing. It's up to you and how you wish to configure your own system for your own environment. But I find that one to be a nice, ready compromise on things. So we've got some authentication going. Should really think about some security at this point. And one of the most important things you can do with a smart card is configure the screensaver. And you want to configure the screensaver to ask for a password. And there's an option when you've got a smart card on the system called token removal. And what that means is if you pull the card out of the reader, you can actually have it automatically lock the machine. And there's plenty of Windows environments do something very similar to this. I can name one UK government department that I've seen independently. Whenever staff leave their public-facing machines, they pull the card out and the machine locks. That's Windows, but this is Mac OS, and you can do exactly the same thing. And what I'll do now is if you're generating a configuration profile, that would be the content, that would be the ideal contents of your configuration profile. So ask for password is set to 1, meaning it's on. Ask for password delay we'll get to in just a bit. And the token removal action is also set to 1. Now, why have I got ask for password delay set to 5? Because that means 5 seconds. And the simple answer is, even in 10.13, there was a bug in macOS where if you set it to 0, it doesn't work. So I set it to 5 seconds, and it does work. And that's just mimicking the options that are already available in the GUI. Now, if you're in a security-conscious environment, and you probably are if you're dealing with smart cards, you're going to want to think about disk encryption. And disk encryption has a few issues. You're going to have to disable File Vault 2 automatic pass-through of login credentials. The pre-boot environment on File Vault 2 cannot handle smart cards. It doesn't have the USB capability to deal with the smart card readers. There's no built-in OS in order to handle it. It won't load the drivers. But that's fine, because there's ways around this. So to stop it doing an automatic pass-through, sure enough, it's another configuration profile. Now, I've got the hide 500 users in there because it's something I like having, because I do hide accounts on the system, like the JSS management account. But there's a not documented key called disable FDE auto login, and you set that to true. So what actually happens is you turn on the machine, you get the File Vault screen, you put in the password for whatever account has come up, it will go through the boot process, and then it will dump you at a standard login window. And that's then your opportunity to then use the smart card to authenticate in. But we haven't talked about reader drivers. And the reason for that is the pre-inbuilt Apple drivers are actually good enough. I have not found any occasion on the modern OS releases where it's actually necessary to install a third-party driver. Word of warning, if you're using VMware Fusion to do any testing, VMware Fusion has a virtual driver that it puts in its place. That's been there since version 8.5.3. Hasn't caused me any issues yet, but it could. It used to just pass the reader hardware straight through, and now it does this. The other thing about VMware Fusion is if you don't turn the USB support down from USB 3 to USB 2, it doesn't work at all. And that bug is still there as of the latest version 10.01. So like I say, there can be dragons. Okay, let's talk about actual reader hardware. I've experienced some of this, but it's not the complete list of hardware that's out there. The OmniKey 3121, I actually have one of these with me. If you're interested, come up to me after the talk, and I'll dig it out of my bag over there and show you it. It's a chunky bit of hardware. It's probably the best card reader, most reliable card reader I've ever used. Has a nice standard USB connector on it, has a nice long cable. You can mount it on the desk. There's a sticky pad on the back where you can attach it to a monitor in case of, semi-permanent workstation environments. And it doesn't need any prodding. It just works with the inbuilt Apple CCID drivers. But it's not the most portable of devices, it must be said. And Apple, also on their website, will have this. And there's a few different versions of this, and they all look identical. So you've got the SCR 3500, you've got the SCR 3500A, you had the Identiv Cloud 2900R, and they look absolutely identical. You need a magnifying glass to tell them apart. They literally are a little tiny box there. You fold them out, you put the card in, you plug it into the USB, and it should work. But if you're dealing with older OSs, I really hope you never need their driver package. And here's why. This is a section of one of the scripts in their driver package that I managed to find online. And anyone who does anything with bash will know immediately that you do not write out plist files with echo commands. I mean, there is so much bad practice going on in this, it is absolutely unbelievable. I remember showing this to one person who absolutely blew a fuse when this was happening.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Okay, I'll get on with it. So let's deal with the smart cards themselves and the token D stuff. So this is now the specific token D configuration. Everything we've done before is completely universal. This is now the older legacy stuff, and there's still plenty of this stuff out there. So the login window actually requires a configuration change before you can use smart cards to authenticate in. And to do that, we need to do bad things to the authorization database. I'm not comfortable with fiddling with the authorization database, but thankfully, when you actually start having a look at the command to do stuff, you'll notice that there's a section there where it's actually got a smart card specific entry. So we've got smart card enable, disable, and status. And it's like, we can probably use this to our advantage. So let's see what happens. So if I run a status command, and everything's been configured the way we want by using the enable command, this is the output that you get. Current smart card login status enabled, and then some extra stuff to tell you that the authentication rule's enabled. And then there's the standard security authorization DB command output, which is yes at the bottom. Now, the curious thing to note for anyone who does bash scripting is the yes part at the bottom comes out of standard error. So if you capture the output of this, we can process this and do things with it. But if it hasn't been enabled, this is what you get instead. And literally, there is one word change there. So current smart card login state, disabled. Enabled, disabled. We can do things with that. So let's have an extension attribute. And I like extension attributes if I'm having to programmatically set stuff over and over and I don't want people to fiddle with it because I want reporting. And it's very simple. We run the output of that command. We awk it so that we get the fifth word output only. And then we echo it back out to the JSS and it either reports enabled or disabled. That's quite neat. Comes in quite handy. And it's computationally not very expensive when you're running lots of EAs. So once you've got your EA and you've got some reporting on the status of this stuff, what can we do with it? Well, I usually scope EAs off to smart groups. Smart groups are handy. It allows me to do things like whack the config on the machine, but only when necessary. So here's your smart group window. You give it a name. And the criteria itself is very, very simple. You scope it off to the extension attribute, and you say is not enabled. And there's a reason why I do it this apparently backwards way. If you were just checking for, if you're checking to see if it is enabled, you have an edge case where if the machine is first enrolled, all of the EAs are blank. So you have to do your checking on the assumption of, unless it specifically says it's enabled, you want to assume that it is disabled. So I go is not enabled. And that way, if there's anything else comes in there, we're going to get remediation. And the last thing is, we've got our check. We've got our smart group. We now need the policy to actually do the remediation. And the policy is simple. Again, it's a name. It's a category. I set it to recurring check-in because I want it to, if it needs remediation, I want it to happen promptly. You set the execution frequency to ongoing, and the reason for that is your smart group is going to control when this thing fires, not the execution frequency. Again, it's scoped off the smart computer group that we created before, specific computers, specific users. And all you do is in the execute command, you put security authorization DB smart card enable. And that will just run whenever you need it to and no more. I like the principle of we only run things when we have to. We don't run things all the time. So what we actually haven't done is told macOS how to recognize the card for a specific user. And the first technique for this is what Apple calls hash matching. So it takes the hash values of the certificates on the card, and you can append it to the local user account. So we're not actually using AD accounts at this point. We're just using local accounts. So what happens is you put in the card, that's all paired up. It invites you to unlock the card. It matches the hash, and, profit. So how do you do this? Well, the command in question is called scauth, and it has a bunch of options in there for if you're doing it manually. So if you run scauth hash on the terminal, it will print all of the hashes that it can find on the system. Then the other command that is relevant is called scauth accept, and you can then specify a username, and then you specify the hash key that you got from the previous command. And that will do a basic pairing of the hash of the certificates on the card to the user account. So when you actually run it, it looks a bit like this. So when you run scauth hash, you will get a bunch of internal Apple stuff, but you'll also, usually as the top line, get the hash of what's on the card. And by the way, I have obfuscated this stuff because anyone who knows the hex knows that hex does not go up to I. So after that, you get the general principle. You have to run scauth accept as sudo, because otherwise it will not have the appropriate rights to make changes to the DSCL backend database. You give it my username, you give it that hash, it wants an admin password, and bosh, you're done. So if you want to do this programmatically, here's a quick and dirty script that I came up with to actually do this. So the first thing I do is I find out what the current logged in user is. Thank you again, Ben Toms and Frogo, for finding this one out and blogging about it quite a few years ago. It's probably one of the most copied bits of code that I ever use anywhere. You find what the hash is by running the scauth hash command. You run it through awk to get the first line, and only the first section of the first line. And once you've got that, I've got some echo out to say what hash that it's actually found, and just echo that out so that if you're running this, you can see what it's doing. And it pairs it to the currently logged in user. And yeah, it's just passing variables to scauth at that point. And what that basically means is if, say, for example, you're at the screensaver, our standard screensaver unlock screen would look like this. Boring. You've seen this all before, I'm sure. But when you've got a smart card inserted on the system, the username locks out, and the password entry changes to PIN. It now wants the PIN of the smart card. And that's so it can unlock the smart card and do the comparison that we mentioned earlier. And when it works, it lets you in. So, some summation so far. We've installed the drivers. We might have installed some breeder drivers, depending on what you've got. We've definitely installed some root certificate from your AD. You've done some work with the Authorization DB for the login window, and you have hash matched the card to the user account. And at that point, you go, it works. Hey! But that's the old legacy system. We've got the new one to go from. And so some good news. This is a lot simpler than you thought it was going to be. And judging by the lack of laughter, there's no Top Gear fans in the audience side too. Okay.
Get on with it!
Right, okay. Come on. So the good news with CTK stuff is that you don't have to do authorization database tweaks with CTK-based drivers and cards. It's pretty automatic. But there are some new details to deal with. One of the things Apple's done is they've created a new smart card configuration profile. Anyone who's played around with the latest builds of Jamf will have probably seen it in there at some point and wondered what it's all about. So let's go through it. So you give it a name, a description, yada, yada. We've been through all of this. Yeah. Next. You've got 4 options. Allow user pairing. If you have, say, for example, a modern YubiKey, which can impersonate a PIV, US government PIV-based smart card, and you've ever inserted it into a Virgin system, it will come up with a dialog pairing box. So that first option allows you to enable or disable that pairing dialog, because you may wish to use your own methods to do this. Allow smart card is exactly what it says it is. By default, verify the certificate is trusted is off on CTK stuff, but it is on permanently on the token D stuff. This is why I had you install the root CA stuff earlier. Why Apple has that off by default, I am not sure, because it doesn't seem to make security sense to me, so I always turn that on. And the interesting one at the bottom here is only allow 1 smart card per user. Why you would want to have more than 1 card paired to a user, I'm not entirely sure. I understand there's some organizations that have multiple identities on each card. But if you want to have 1 identity per user, that's the option you take. So the stuff that we mentioned before about hash mapping, I'll try that again. Hash matching is now called fixed key mapping. So Apple changed its terminology. Thanks, guys. And again, it's exactly the same as before. The hash of the certificates on the card are appended to the local user account with the scauth command. But there's some different options this time. So scauth for the CTK stuff has an entry called list, which does things kind of similar. But you have an option called pair, and the options are kind of similar. But this, for the record, scauth is actually a bash script that lives on the machine, so you can actually pull it open and have a look and see what it's doing. For those of you who've been doing macOS for a long time, it's still got references to NICL in there. And if you don't know what that is, just forget I ever mentioned it. It's a good thing. But this is pretty much the same principle as what we did before. So you do scauth list, and this time you get a hash and a hash legacy. Now, this is what happens when I had this is what happens when I had my YubiKey in, and I also had a legacy token D card in there as well. It will actually distinguish between the two, but we're only interested in the first one. And again, it's the pair option, it's my user account, and it's that hash. That blatantly isn't a hash. This is the pairing dialog box I mentioned earlier, but this will also pop up when you run that command, because what it now does is it asks you for the PIN of the card. And what it's supposed to do at this point is to do automatic keychain unlock of the login keychain whenever you log in with this card, which incidentally the older token D stuff does not. This is one of the reasons why there's a limitation with token D, that you have the password on the, sorry, the PIN of the card has to match the password on the user account, otherwise you end up with all sorts of issues. Ooh. It's okay, we can edit that bit out, it's fine. I'm sorry, I am not well, I do apologize. So yeah, it's going to ask, after you put in the PIN of the card, it's going to ask you for the login keychain password. So this is your user account password. And you just put that in and hit OK. And when you get to the login window and you insert your card or your YubiKey, it should change to that. And it's asking you for the PIN. If you want to do this programmatically, this is a variation of the same script from before. Literally, only thing that changed in there was the scauth command. But it's a good thing to get you going. Just remember that this thing needs root, and by my own admission, this is bad, bad, bad. It's great proof of concept, but I would not use this in production. It needs a lot more error checking than it's doing. But you get the idea. So we've dealt with local user accounts for this stuff. But a lot of people who are going to be using smart cards are going to be using this in conjunction with Active Directory. And this is the section that I call PK Init, or How I Learned to Relove AD. Not that there's that much to love about AD, let's face it. So what you do is, this is all about using the smart card certificate to not only authenticate to the system, but authenticate off to your AD to get a Kerberos ticket. So this is kind of complicated, but I'll see if I can explain it to you with the aid of this next set of diagrams. So in the beginning, a user account is created for a user, and it's provisioned with a certificate from the certificate authority. That certificate is then put onto a smart card and given to the user in the corner there. They then use that smart card to authenticate to a macOS device, or even a Windows device for that matter. By unlocking the card, it allows macOS to see the certificates on the card. macOS then takes that certificate and uses it to send a Kerberos ticket granting request off to the AD. The AD then checks that certificate against the certificate authority. The certificate authority is basically going to report that the certificate is valid, or it is invalid, or it is revoked. You then get your TGT reply sent back to macOS. This is either a Kerberos TGT or it is a flat-out denial. If it's a flat-out denial, you don't get allowed into the system. If you get a TGT, it logs in, and you haven't used an AD password at any point in this process, which is kind of a cool thing, right? So we need an AD bind. Well, I thought that Sheldon picture was funnier, but anyway. So you've got to tell the operating system how to interpret the information that's on the card certificate with any information it gets from the AD. And the old legacy system uses a file located at /etc cac login config.plist. That's because this stuff was originally written just for the federal government and its CAC and its CAC card standard. And the file itself looks exactly like that. It's not a properly formatted plist. It never was. You're telling it what DS attribute string and what you're going to compare on the AD to the item on the card that contains the right address. And you've got the format string at the bottom that tells you how to do stuff. Now, a chap from Apple's federal team just the other day told me that it is possible to modify this and the CTK stuff in such a way as to allow offline access, but didn't have time to make it into this talk, I'm afraid. So you write that file in place, you have an AD bind. But for CTK, this has all changed again. They've changed the file, and it's now called smartcardconfig.plist. It's located in the same place, but it has a different format. This is actually a proper XML format file now, and you can specify multiple fields on the card to look for. You can specify if you want a combination of fields to actually look for in the format string section. And again, right at the bottom is the section on AD that you wish to compare it to. But that's with binding to AD, and binding's kind of old hat now. You know, as I'm sure you're aware from everyone who's been at this conference and has been around a lot of the different talks, you know, we don't want to bind to AD anymore. We want to keep the local accounts, but we still want to consume AD services. So, Joel, your plug. Yes, you can wake up. I know, but that wasn't true when I made the slides, was it, Joel? You just said it. You just said it just said it's here.
I mean, it's right here.
Yeah, it's right on your laptop, right there. Yeah. So, confession: I have actually been helping Joel test this and helping him develop it. And Joel, I'm sure, is wanting to thank me gratefully for this, but I'm sure that's a complete lie. Yeah, this is true. But the other thing is, if you don't want to go the Nomad route, anyone who's aware of what Apple has done, Apple has a competing product called Enterprise Connect. They do actually have an Enterprise Connect PKI. Details on this I don't have a lot of, but I can tell you this. You can get it from any Apple reseller. It costs a flat fee of $12,000. And you cannot get a demo of this, but you can be invited to a webinar to see it run. However, if you want to have a look at Nomad, I'm sure Joel there can fix you up with a copy. Time limited, of course. And with that in mind, yeah, Apple won't give you a trial version. So I'm just going to move on from that. So Nomad PKI, this, like I said, I have a little more experience of. I have been helping him beta test it. I have been driving him to absolute distraction. Sorry, Joel, not really. So yes, you can have Kerberos from a smart card certificate without the bind, and you can keep your local accounts, which is really cool. And in future versions, you're going to have an awful lot more. It's effectively, if you've seen Nomad with standard username and passwords, I'm sure if I prod Joel enough, then we'll have it at feature parity, but with smart cards. And this is the point where I have to say that what I'm about to show you is an older beta. It has progressed on significantly since then, but it'll give you an idea and a flavor of what's going on. So yeah, I think we're on beta 22 or 23 right now, but that's build 17. So when you load it up, that's the standard Nomad screen. You have a new accounts window here to deal with multiple identities on a card. And you can specify the identity on the card matched to which user at this point. We've got some preferences in here, and this is the standard stuff that you would expect in Nomad. You're telling it what Kerberos realm to have a look for. That will probably be the same as your root domain. You've got automatically renewed tickets in there, which is simple, but the top one there is the interesting one. Warn if card not removed. Some environments might actually want you to remove the card from the machine so that you don't forget it. You can specify a warning at this point. Joel can give you more details on that. Some of the environments that I've seen don't want you to remove the card from the machine unless you're physically walking away from the machine to lock it. When you have the menu in the corner here, in the standard menu bar, as you've come to expect from Nomad, it'll tell you what expirations you have, there's a sign-in, a lock screen, and all the other Nomad functions are there, as you would expect. But the difference is when you come to sign in, instead of being prompted for a username and password, you'll get a username and PIN, and it will auto-populate the username from what you configured in the accounts PIN, which is kind of cool. So when you've got it all in there, it will show you username off the card. It will show you what domain you've got there, which I've cunningly censored out. And all the other fun stuff is there. Your file shares are there, get software, elevate privileges whenever that's finished. And in short, it behaves like Nomad would normally do with username and password. And Enterprise Connect PKI will do something very similar. And it's up to you which choice that you go, because I can't be seen to shill for one product, especially not you, Joel, because I've been helping you with it. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you.
That's cold.
If you have a question, if you wouldn't mind stepping up to the microphone, although I think you did a great job explaining everything. Oh, we have one.
So if you enforce smart card, what are you doing to change the file vault password?
Right, okay, so I didn't cover this in the talk for reasons of time, but I have a proof of concept script on my GitHub, and what it does is it creates a local user account with a very, very similar name to what's on the card. It makes the account so that you can't actually log into it, but can be enabled for file vault authentication. That's a way of doing it.
Okay.
In the future with CTK, I'm semi-reliably told that in the future, you will be able to specify a config profile that will, at the login window, stop the account password from being used, but it will be allowed to be used to unlock file vault.
Perfect.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for your time today.